The year is 1986, and director Robert Harmon brings us a cruel, nihilistic, and violent tale of a young man named Jim Halsey, who's using a drive-away service to get from Chicago to San Diego. Along the way, he picks up a hitchhiker who calls himself John Ryder, who quickly reveals himself to be a murderous psychopath who pulls fellow travelers into a string of deadly road games, leaving bodies in his wake. Every time Jim gets away, he realizes that Ryder is one step ahead of him, leading the two travelers into a deadly game of cat and mouse that will leave one of them dead. We discuss The Hitcher, starring Rutger Hauer, C. Thomas Howell, and Jennifer Jason Leigh, this week on Back to the Balcony. Gene Siskel and Rutger Ebert, two titans of cinematic review. Sometimes right, sometimes wrong, but always captivating. Your hosts Antonio of the Cult-Worthy Cinema Podcast and Justin Henson of the Movie Wire are here to take you back to the balcony. Okay, so first and foremost, this to me has always been, in my mind, like the granddaddy of torture porn horror films, right? At least mainstream ones, not the ones that you find like behind the beaded curtain in the snuff film section of the old video stores. When we think of movies like Hostel, I'm even going to say like Saw and some of Final Destination, where there's just an utter sense of doom and wanton violence and cruelty. This might be like the first real American mainstream one that I can think of that wasn't made as an intentional horror film. It has horror film roots, but I think they were going after a wider audience, in my opinion. And I also think that is why Roger and Gene hated it so much, because it dared to step outside of the horror box where they felt it should have been firmly planted. How do you feel about this movie?
So unlike my critics, I don't agree, and we'll get into that later, but open and honest, I hated this movie. I hated this movie. And not almost in contrary to what our critics are going to say, because I don't think it went far enough, because I think it played it too safe. And here's what I did like about this movie. I loved the hook in the beginning. I loved the last 10 minutes, but the last 10 minutes, the climax, just made me reflect on how much in the middle we were missing of what this could have been. You can take the first 20 and then the last 10 minutes, put together, slap a commercial in the middle of it, and call it a small TV show, because there is little to no advantage of creativity that happens in the middle, except for a couple snippets that I thought were really good. But I don't think it went far enough to really tap into what this movie could have been, and that's the most frustrating piece of it. I watched it as a teenager. I got bored with it as a teenager. And during the rewatch of it, I looked at it and I just threw my head back saying, can we have something happen of interest in the middle of this movie that actually did have a good potential of the protagonist and the antagonist really having this relationship, but it really doesn't tap into that to really go all in. And that's what I think is missing for me in this movie is the risk factor of going all in. And we see snippets of what this movie could have been, but it doesn't do it consistently.
I can get on board with your opinion. I have a completely different one. So first of all, to go back and do like a little bit of the backstory, what you wanted out of this movie is what was written. The screenwriter Eric Red wrote this thing when he was 20 years old, and it had all of the torture porn elements that I was just referring to in the sense of Saw and Hostel and films like that. And when he sold it, nobody wanted to make that movie, but they liked the idea of the movie. And so Robert Harmon, who had just done a made-for-TV movie called China Lake, in which Charles Napier plays a highway patrolman who's also a ravenous serial killer. Michael Parks played that character in another version of that film later on, but he already had a taste for this idea of road horror, which I love that subgenre of the horror empire. Movies like Road Games and Breakdown, they're borderline noir and borderline horror. So I call them road horror. This definitely was rooted in the idea that it was supposed to be extreme. You were going to see the massacre of the family in the station wagon. You were going to see in full detail Jennifer Jason Leigh being torn apart. That was all in the script. And so they had to find a way to cleverly hint at those moments and at those elements, but not really show us everything. And even in the uncut version, they don't show you everything. They just show you longer shots of the aftermath, essentially. So I think what you wanted was the original idea, but I don't think they were ready, or at least the studio wasn't committed to give us that. But on that point, just imagine how much more they would have hated it, Gene and Roger, had they gone and done that version.
And this is one of those nuggets where you have Howard. It's a great performance. Don't get me wrong. I think the menace to him is there, and I think the written character is there. We have all in kind of character where he doesn't care if he wants to die. He has I don't care written all over him on the actions that he does, and there is a stake to that. And I think when we get that in the first 15, 20 minutes, and then we go into the middle of it where it just ends up being a guy running around a lost highway, a desert where he goes where nobody ever is. And that's where it loses it. And it's almost like Howard was on leave during most of the movie and they just place him in different aspects and try to do the best that they can. And I think that's where my frustration is we take all these lost highway movies, these thrillers, and we automatically compare them almost, especially in the 80s and 90s. And the most likable, menacing character we don't see enough of when to create this chaos, to create this menace. It's almost like Howell is running a one-man show in the second to third act and beginning third act, and he has to rely on are the cops going to catch me? Am I going to be blamed for all this? And I don't care about any of that because we get the idea of that, but I want to see the menace of it. And even if the studios don't want to go all in on the gore, which I get, but at least we can have some thrills in the end. And when we have these shots by Harmon that are really good shots here and there, they don't feel earned. They feel thrown in to kind of compensate for the lack of thrills that we get in. It's almost like we're trying to pick and choose what kind of movie this wants to be. And that's where I kind of threw my head back and say, can we please just choose something to do with the middle of this movie?
Okay, yeah, I can see where you're coming from. I personally enjoy that kind of leisurely pace in the middle because it's too close to what, let's say, movies like Duel that Spielberg did or Joyride by John Dahl. And John Dahl, in my opinion, takes a lot from Robert Harmon in a lot of his films, a lot of the style that he has used in his noir movies. Oddly enough, I feel like there's a lot of Red Rock West in this movie, just on a horror element. I feel like there's a very similar vibe and theme and mood. So, yeah, if you made this a nonstop thrill ride, then you may as well just say it's a more violent version of Duel. So that's where I like that it does take its time and it lets you focus on a character. Maybe as much as I like C. Thomas Howell's performance in this, maybe he's not the right guy to play this role because as good of a performance as he gives, the character itself is not that interesting. Like, you're right, it's a fugitive story all throughout the middle. And if there is one thing I will agree with the critics when they get into it, is there is a female character. There is Jennifer Jason Leigh, and she is utterly underused, in my opinion. She is kind of just the girl that wanders into the story and then becomes the damsel in distress. And I feel that she deserved more characterization and development than that. Because when the stakes happen with her character, it does feel a little cheap because you don't have the connection with her to really make that moment feel truly earned. So I will agree with you on that. And at the same time, maybe that just means that we needed someone maybe a little bit more magnetic. Maybe this was a role for someone that wasn't as, let's say, strong of an actor, but more of a powerful personality.
There's a better movie in here 100%. And I think what's really missing in this element, especially in the middle, is that they rely too much on Howell's character. They throw some dirt on him, they throw a little blood on his forehead during situation over situation. It gets tiresome. Even when we get to the scene where he first meets Nash with Jason Leigh, that there are no people again in this diner. It's like the filmmakers are picking and choosing not to have him integrate with people during the middle. And when he does go on a bus or he does get involved with people, there's no interaction to it, where this is a good opportunity for filmmakers to really kind of conversate or even get involved with these side or these extras to find out what this character is, to add some interest to him. But we're relying solely on this individual in his almost inner thoughts or his physical interactions of running or out of breath or whatever it may be. And that's not interesting. Human interaction, when it comes to what this movie is trying to do, would have added to a lot of the one thrills and two, a lot of the earned shots that the director tries to do. It would have been a perfect balance to actually give more people something to do instead of relying on this individual character. And I agree with you. The casting on this, he is boring after just watching him for about 15, 20 minutes as an individual in these scene over scene of just nothingness. So it would have been a smart pivot to the director to actually add some more people or interactions to actually make this character somewhat appealing, interesting, or likable.
Yeah, because that is one of the double-edged swords of a character like that is if you want to take the cheap way out, you give him some kind of tick, right? You give him something that makes him more interesting throughout. You make him a stutterer. You make him have an internal conflict that he has to overcome to be the main guy at the end. And this guy doesn't have it. He's just literally driving some dude's car from one part of the country to the other, and all of this happens. We don't get enough of his backstory to really care about what happens to him. So, yeah, I think that is probably a writer's error. And who knows? I have not read that original script. There might be a lot more exposition in there to help explain why he is the way he is, and it just got left out when they truncated the movie into whatever this is. But this brings me to my next question for you is like, I've never really asked you your opinion on films that are style over substance intentionally. Does that matter to you? If a film is intentionally being more stylistic because it knows that the substance isn't there, so it wows you with its style, if done right, do you think that can still be considered a good film, or do you need the substance to equate to the style?
I've always respected a filmmaker if they can kind of compensate for a lack of something that they see in the lack of dialogue or the lack of a performance, and really kind of intersect that with a visual style and really move that story along. So you can, and filmmakers have this all the time where they get in the middle of the movie and they're like, man, this actor sucks or this dialogue sucks. We got to do something to make this more interesting. It happens. And that's where I really appreciate the pivot when it comes to how a film is being told. Because at the end of the day, it's about the telling of a story. And you can have bad casting choices, you can have a lack of dialogue with substance. But if you can have a visual really carry that story to the finish line, that is brilliant filmmaking. And that's where the appreciation for me goes into play. You don't have to have a lot of substance and dialogue. I appreciate the substance. I love that thinking in a movie, but the filmmaking technique of getting the story to the end point and having it valid and full of entertainment value and even thought provoking to an extent is what really matters to me. And here is, I think, a good example of where there wasn't a lot of pivot.
Would you consider this more a horror film or more of a psychological thriller?
If this was made today in the same style, this would be almost an elevated horror, in my opinion, because it does go over style of substance. We can see the attempt here. We can see the shots, and they're not all good shots. We have a handful of good shots here. But I think this would be more of a psychological thriller, but a missed psychological thriller, because we get the hook, we get the intent of what the killer is, we know what the outcome is going to be, and it does teeter more to the psychological thriller aspect of it. But this is where I think you're right. It's so many genres that it tries to do, or it just doesn't know what it wants to be based on who knows what the script was prior. So I think this one is a more of a psychological piece, but it missed the mark on the psychological.
It really does play a lot of chords from other genres, like and specifically 40s film noir. Wandering into the diner, meeting the lone waitress who tries to help him. And we've seen that copied and emulated in many different neo noir films. It just feels like very 40s, 50s roadside noir to me. Which, again, there's nothing wrong with that. But at the end of the day, if you spend too much time dabbling in one genre and not sticking to the landing of what your film actually is, it can be disruptive for certain audiences. Now, again, like I'm the more of the appreciator and I delve deeper into the bowels of cinema than you do. You're a lot more current than I am. So just like our Seems Like Old Times episode, where I saw the appreciation in the homages to like the old 30s madcap comedies that it was trying to do that I liked. I feel this is doing the same thing. But I also feel like it is trying to jump on the bandwagon of the horror craze of the 80s, specifically the slasher genre, because you do have the mad killer. He doesn't necessarily do slash kills. They're a little bit more manipulated and calculated. But when he does frenzy kill, it is pure horror. So that is where I think they were trying to go with it marketing wise, where they were trying to get that audience. And some audiences caught on to what it was doing with its other genre experimentation. And then others, including our critics, just didn't like the whole package. And so I think that's one of the more interesting things about this conversation with those two is very rarely have we seen them be in such agreement of how much they disliked a movie. And I find that conversation very interesting.
We're going to get into it. I am good. It is an interesting conversation and a complete disagreement. We'll get into it. But will give the movie credit on this is not always show and telling what it's going to do. I love the scene with the Hitcher with the family. I love the idea of not showing us everything, but at the same time, it doesn't give us anything of thirst for that genre, I would say. That doesn't give us anything to really be appealing after that. It just gives us merely ideas. And I think the real trouble with this is it gives us leave us alone with our inner thoughts of what's going to happen and leave us with nothing after that. It needed a balance of both. And that's where I think this movie was kind of just the miss on where it wanted to go with it.
And I'm hit and miss on the appreciation factor of the mythology of the villain. The John Ryder character. Like I said, is this a guy who's just been going back and forth on the same stretch of road for decades doing what he's doing? Or is there something otherworldly about him? Is this a metaphysical character? Is it a demon? We don't get any of that backstory. And I think that's frustrating for some, or in my case, fascinating because it just makes me create my own mythos for this guy, right? I think that's part of the fun of this movie is it like the Santa Claus, right? Because we will get into it in a second. These two completely give away all of the spoilers of the movie, not only in the review, the studio did it too. This clip, it was 5 minutes long. I edited all of the footage that they sent from the studio to these guys, but they gave them the two most crucial moments of the film in long form to play on this show. So they spoiled the movie, not only with their review, but they spoiled the movie in the footage that they showed. It blew my mind. But going back to my point of, I like the idea that there is an ambiguity to the end of the film that will let you create your own mythology for this character the way that we were kind of forced to create a mythology for John Ryder's character. I like that. I like it when a film can let you be interactive with the plot progression and not necessarily tell you were right or wrong.
Here is a movie that pretends to say one thing and is really saying another thing altogether. That's Rutger Hauer as the hitchhiker. He turns into a Superman in this movie, able to be everywhere and know everything, and in this scene survives suicidal stunt. Now, it looks in that scene like The Hitcher is a high-speed action movie, and it is. Technically, it's very well made. That scene was well made. But what is this movie saying? That older man tortures that boy all through the movie. He plays tricks on him, he tries to kill him, he frames him for murder, he kills his girlfriend. He completely takes charge of that young boy's life. He is evil personified. And at the end of the movie, what happens? Something very sick happens. There is the unmistakable implication that that kid sort of liked that treatment and that he might become the next Hitcher. Later in the show, we have a movie named 9½ Weeks that's gotten a lot of publicity for its story of kinky sex. But if you look beneath the surface of The Hitcher, this movie is 10 times more perverted, more heartless, and more cruel. It's a deeply cynical movie that doesn't even have the courage to admit what it's really about, which is gay sadomasochism. And I don't know which I hated more in this movie, the cynicism or the dishonesty.
Okay, so what are your opinions on his take on that?
That went off the rails real quick. So, you can agree with it. I mean, there is a deeper conversation here, and I get what he's trying to say, but psychologically, I think when it comes to the build of thrills, excitement, the adrenaline rush, there's an attraction to those that create that feeling. I get that, but at the same time, the movie doesn't really go in to discover that, and I get where he's trying to go with it, but to kind of relate this movie to one strict point and going more sexual with it, I can't support that because it is a psychological. I can agree with the psychological aspect and effects of what the adrenaline rush really gave this young man, but at the same time, there's no supporting aspects of it to even hint at that when it comes to the progression of the movie all the way to the climax. So this is just assumption, and it's assuming what the writer and the director's intent was here. And there is definitely, especially in this movie, not enough information to really make that assumption, especially in a critic review.
Well, there's not enough information in either the screenwriter or the filmmaker's projects before this film to insinuate that. My opinion is that Roger's projection of that idea onto this movie is that the 80s and late 70s just ruined him, right? Like, he had to sit through Cruisin', he had to sit through Looking for Mr. Goodbar, he had to go through this whole kind of like sexual revolution of filmmaking in the late 70s, early 80s, that anytime you see a lack of female characters on screen, he automatically has to assume that there is some kind of homoerotic subtext to the film, which I don't see it in this movie. This movie is about cruelty. This movie is about getting your kicks off of the violence. This movie is not about, I'm going to say, in any way, shape, or form, gay sadomasochist subtext at all.
Well, this is a guy that really verbalizes our antagonist that wants to die. He doesn't care if he dies. So this is more of a psychological piece on a character study of a man on what leads him to kill and doesn't care about the outcome. So making that a sexual piece, and I don't know if he pulled that from the female being tied up with the truck or whatnot, but anytime there's women, and we've talked about this before, women in peril and a dominant male figures in a movie, that's where we kind of go off the rails. And I think a lot of the 80s, when it comes to the sexual topics of the media and where movies are going, really did cloud their judgment and their mind. And this one is probably one of their most prominent reviews to display that.
For sure. And a movie that is really about nihilism. It's a nihilistic piece. If it's nihilistic, it can't be about something else. It's just about the loss of humanities and the loss of conscience and the loss of conscience. That's what like this thing really focuses on. The stretch there was just a little bit crazy. But that was his opinion. Gene jumps in.
Well, Roger, I can't quantify the hatred I have for this movie, but I'm going to try.
Okay.
Because I get paid to do that. Very early on, and we saw that first scene, the dismemberment scene. That's the hook. We're supposed to now get interested. This guy's tough. We didn't need the explicit. I didn't even like the language use of this dismemberment. That's how short my fuse has become on violence when I see it in service of something that is nothing more than violence. This film is nothing more than a dozen ways to chop up a person. That's really all it's about. And there's a scene in here, and I want to get real specific about it, where a woman is tied up between two trucks, and I'm figuring there's no way that they're going to actually have the guy
I
step
never
on the
believed. I
never thought I would ever see that in a movie. She's pulled, her limbs are pulled apart.
So he got a little bit softer in his opinions of violence later on because we already covered the episode where one of his favorite movies of 97, 98 was John Carpenter's Vampires, which is a gorier and much more violent film than this one. I think what really gets Gene is the fact that he's cool with violence if it's done playfully, but when there is a sincere cruelty to it, he finds it very abusive and disheartening to him as a critic. And I think that's where he's coming from on this one. So I can honestly say I give him higher marks in his opinion than Roger because he didn't reach into his magic box of socio-political causes and say that this movie is this way because of this thing that's going on. This, I don't know, I'm not going to say activism, but whatever he's doing that's projecting his idea that he has to defend a community or put down a filmmaker who is trying to create a subversive context of a community, that was a reach. At least Gene is being sincere in the fact that he just doesn't like the cruelty of the movie.
This is a really pick it and choose it, but depending on your mood of when you see this movie, and just like a lot of horror movies with these two, or thrillers, I should say, the idea is what they don't like. It's what they're inserting their own ideas into what's happening in this movie that's really making them dislike this movie. Because you're absolutely right. There are tons of gorier movies in the 80s. And I don't know if this was at the tail end. It was 86. It shouldn't have been. But this is where it really doesn't make sense. You tagged on the playfulness of horror, and I kind of get that. But they've liked movies in the past that are just hardcore horror, but they have a little bit more substance to it. But this one doesn't go all in, and that was my main problem with the movie, is it didn't go far enough. As I don't know if that makes me sick, but at the same time, if you're going to have a vision, go all in with it. This one left the audience with their own feelings, their own thoughts, and their own ideas. And what you took away from that is what you're going to vocabulate. This is what you're going to actually review. So when it comes to the horror aspect of it, they're not critiquing it on what they saw. They're critiquing the idea of what the filmmaker and what the screenwriter are portraying. So that's where we have the problem with a lot of these horror films when it comes to movie critics and movie reviews, is that they don't really give appreciation to the idea. Because honestly, I like the scene with the girl tied up. I love the tension of that because it didn't show.
It's paced so good.
It is. It is tense. It woke me up from my head slinging to the back of my couch. It is very intense to watch, and that is the intent. That's what the filmmaker wants you to feel, and it worked. It got me up, and it got me to pay attention for the rest of the movie and get engaged in it. And if it takes a scene like that of just giving an idea of what's happening on screen, kudos to the filmmaker.
No, I agree with you 100%. And there are so many elements of this movie that have been duplicated in films made after it. I'm not going to get into the whole list, but like we have seen that kind of scene before. I mean, this movie even had a remake and like a made-for-TV sequel. This movie has a legacy. It has a huge cult following. I would say I'm part of that cult. But yeah, I mean, a year later, RoboCop comes out, and Gene calls it one of the best movies of the year.
But that goes into the exact playfulness. So you have to have violence with comedy. You have to have violence with a satire. You have to have violence with a message to it. So if you just have the violence with just the intended thrills and nothing in between, then that's not going to be their cup of tea. That's where they're going to use it as a vehicle that we saw so much in the 80s and early 90s of their political views of how movies are viewed. I mean, these were victims, and movies were in danger at this point of being censored based on content and violence. And these reviews don't help with that. And thank God that we are kind of in an area now where art house really did spike up and have an appreciation for the vision of a filmmaker. It just sucks that the Hitcher had to be the one that I vented on that with. So that sucks.
This is what American movies have come
And
to.
although she's brought in allegedly as the love interest, there was never any love interest between her and the kid,
You
because
bet.
all of the love interest in this movie, and the movie is
Yeah,
not
yeah.
honest enough to admit it,
You got
is
it.
between these two people, and they're
Yeah.
using this violent game as some sort of perverted sex in a way that the movie will not acknowledge.
And I want to acknowledge some of the people behind this movie, because I always like to have them come out from behind the rocks. Silver Screen Partners, which is basically a tax shelter deal, HBO Films, new to the making of movies, and TriStar, a relatively new film company. These are all new, fresh money in Hollywood. And they're all new, fresh money, and they've all been taken for a ride, and they're all taking us for a ride. They're putting garbage on the air, and that's what happens sometimes with these new people playing the movie game.
I don't think we like this movie.
He's played that card before. I believe Silent Night, Deadly Night was the film that he essentially gave out like the producer's name. He essentially doxed the people that made the movie because there was so much uproar over it from the religious groups, conservative groups, and parents of like Santa Claus cannot be satanic and a killer, blah, blah, blah. And he's done that before, and then he does it again where he is like calling out the actual production studios that made these movies. But we've had this conversation several times where it's like they don't care. The studios are a business. They're not out there to be your conscience. They're not out there to, give you the lessons of right or wrong. And if there's moral compensation in a film, it's not from the good of their hearts. It's because audiences like seeing moral compensation in some movies. We totally talked about this in the Women in Danger episode, where they completely fuzzed over the fact that these final girls are strong women that overcome the slasher, the stabber, the horror guy in these movies. And they just said that it was punishment towards women in the women's movement. What is this film a punishment for? It's not. It's an exercise in violence and cruelty, but it's not a lesson in gore. Like, there wasn't a lot of gore in this movie. So honestly, at the end of the day, I think they are disappointed and offended by the nihilism and by the cruelty of this movie, and the fact that these newer studios at the time in Hollywood were the ones making these movies and not the big studios that they think put out great films, like the old Standby studios. But at the end of the day, they should know that these people are completely empty inside. Like, they have no moral compass. It's all about money. It's all about seats and tickets sold and home video and all that nonsense. So it does piss me off when he tries to put some kind of, moral hierarchy on the studios that he respects, but not the newer studios that are making horror movies.
Well, joke's on him for people that went into this movie and actually liked it. So now they're going to be seeking out these studios and looking forward to the next movie. So that... He did it with, I think, Friday the 13th, too, where he actually gave the producer's address or something like that, which absolutely is stupid. Because here's the deal, is back in the 80s, you had 4 or 5 movies come out each and every week. And again, we talked about this before, each one attacking an emotional element, thriller, horror, drama, whatever it may be. So here...
Romantic comedy, yeah.
Yeah. Here is one that no filmmaker is going to know the end result. These are the executives that are going to sign the check, cross their fingers, listen to the review, say it's a bad review, hit pause and look at the box office numbers and say, people liked it. Give me another one, or let's pump out another one of this genre and see if we can do it again. So nobody cares. So if a movie like this, it's low budget, it tries to do what it does to get teenagers in seats. We've talked about it before. If it does that job and it has maybe half the audience leave the theater with a smile on their face that they had a good time, that's a successful movie. So and I hate it when they do this, they add these political aspects of it, and I hate it. I've said it over and over again on my show, when you add politics into movies, leave it to the side. Don't put it in your review, because at the end of the day, it's about the audience and it's about what we experience going to a movie. So here I will give them kudos, because they probably did encourage more people to see this movie. Because if I listened to this review, if I was a teenager in 86, I would rush to the theater to see this movie.
Yeah.
So that I will give them kudos on a great review of encouraging youth to go see this movie.
I mean, in this day and age, we call it virtue signaling. And I think what it does for them in a negative in this particular review is it there's so many episodes that contradict what they are saying in this episode. And I think that's one of the things that, like, I even have to be hyper aware of being a podcaster with three shows and, something like 300 episodes now published between all three. It's like, what did I say 100 episodes ago that someone could pull out of a hat and use it as oh, you just contradicted yourself. Okay, but I'm also not married to any of the ideas that I'm speaking. One, I'm not owned and paid for by a company like they are by a network. My opinion is free. No one's paying for this shit. Advertisers aren't flowing into our stream right now trying to give us money, but telling us what to say and, which direction we should go in our opinion. But I think that is the biggest problem when they get vocal like this, is that when they do contradict themselves, they didn't realize because they were just making this in a time where they didn't think that anyone would ever watch them again, right? They didn't know that YouTube existed and we could pull up an episode in 5 seconds and then have a 45-minute podcast about it a week later.
Yeah, and again, one thing with the contradiction, who knows what they thought about it later down the road? I mean, even with reviews that I've done that I've given 1 to 2 stars for, and I took me by surprise, I maybe added another half star to it, but people change as we grow, and here is one that I would have been really curious to see in 10 years down the road, if they still had those views, if they actually took a breath, watched the movie for what it was without any influence, because it's hard for me to believe this review without any influence when it comes to the era that they're in and what their feelings are on the industry at that time. So this one, I don't think would have gotten the same reaction if this came out 10 years later down the road. When it comes to how they viewed this movie, I can guarantee it's a completely different review.
Let's go ahead and give these guys our critiques. Now, with Gene, as much as I despise his getting on the soapbox and getting all political with his rant at the end, I can appreciate why he didn't like this movie, because it's mostly the same reason why you don't like this movie. It is an exercise in cruelty, but you want more meat to that. You want more of the story, or go further with the cruelty so it actually is that experience and you know what it is at face value, and not this kind of muddled genre film that it really kind of is, despite the fact that I actually enjoy it. So I didn't like this review, but I also didn't hate it because, like I said, he is being sincere. He's not pulling out these weird conspiracy thoughts like Roger is. So for that, I'm going to give the dude a C.
Think that's fair. And again, even though I hate's a strong word. I dislike this movie. But it does have nuggets in it that I did enjoy. But I almost brought out a tinfoil hat just for this review, just to put Roger's review on it, because it adds nothing of value, of substance of the movie. It doesn't add any real opinion other than something that is just far out there that I just can't even comprehend. I think I watched this review probably about 4 times, just absolutely stunned on where he was going. So I have no flipping clue what the hell he's talking about. So it's a solid 1 star for Roger on this one.
It is more harmful in the rhetoric that he's using to describe his thoughts in this movie to that community than the fact that he thinks he's defending that community by blaming the movie. I think it's more harmful in what he's saying than helpful, but I don't think he realized that. And I agree, it's a 1 star. It might be the winner of my least favorite review of 2025, and this is literally the 3rd episode of 2025. So it could get a lot worse from here, but as of right now, this wins that award.
That is going to be a hard one to top on this one. I've already bookmarked this one to really go down on that list, because I will be shocked if we can find a worse review than this one.
If you're a listener out there and you know of a worse one, let us know and we'll review that film and we'll see if we can get it into that award ceremony at the end of the year. Okay, well, I mean, it's cool that we don't have the same opinion of this movie. I would not call this a good movie by any means, but I enjoy this movie for what it does, and I watch it all the way through. I don't skip to the parts that I like. So I will give it that. And it is on my shelf. And I like it enough to have rewatchability for it. But I also know I'm a selective audience. This isn't a movie I'm going to tell my friends, oh, you got to watch The Hitcher, because I know better.
Well, I think with this one, again, it's going to be one that I revisit down the road because I think it's been about 3 views in the last like 15 years. So there are elements, even though I disliked it, there are appreciations. I'll pull your card of shots that I just said, that's a cool shot, or an element like the car pulling away scene that I thought was good. And I love the climax and the beginning, but I just didn't like anything in between that added or led up to the climax. So again, I will watch the first 15 minutes and I watch the last 10 minutes and just think of that as a short movie.
You know, the cinematography reminded me a lot of another film the same year, and that was Raising Arizona. Those empty highway scenes with the under-cranked camera and those car chases, I was like, wow, that's very Barry Sonnenfeld cinematography. I liked it. That'd be an interesting double feature, Raising Arizona and The Hitcher. All right, so next week, we have our first listener request of 2025 of The Thing, directed by John Carpenter. So this is 1982. It's a classic in many people's opinions, but what did these guys think of it back when it came out? And what a year that was. I mean, there might be more 1982 films in this season just so we can talk about how they were completely trampled by the movies that came out that year.
This one, it was a fantastic recommendation, and I knew it was going to end up on this show at some point because it's going to be a great discussion on the critics' review, and I think it's going to be a great discussion between us. I can almost predict.
Yeah, I agree. Okay, everyone, so thank you for watching, listening. Give us 5 stars, rate, review, subscribe to our YouTube channel. We are getting more traction on YouTube than on audio, and I think that's a good sign because it means people actually like to look at us a little bit, right? They're like, oh, that's what they look like. Cool. We look better than Siskel and Ebert, in my opinion, but hey.
Depends on the day.
What do you do?
But yeah.
Depends on the day. You can find me and my other show, the Cultworthy Cinema Podcast, at thecultworthy.com. And you can find my friend Justin Henson over at The Movie Wire on
themoviewire.com.
And like we always say, please reach out to us, give us suggestions for films that you want us to see us cover, as long as they were reviewed by Siskel and Ebert on their shows, and we will get those on the list. Justin, I will see you next week.
See you next week.